There is a number that stops meteorologists mid-sentence when they say it out loud.
Fairly large, well, they're both about the same size. One has lifted, and the second one is definitely on the ground.
368. That is the number of confirmed tornadoes that touched down across the United States during a 4-day span in late April 2011.
And it's hurling out right now, actually. I'm not close enough to it.
368 in 4 days across 26 states, from Texas to New York. But within that number, inside the single most violent day of that outbreak, there is a smaller number that carries an almost unbearable weight: 324. 324 people who were alive at dawn on April 27, 2011, and were gone by midnight.
Trying to drive down this road over these down power lines, not sure how safe that is, but you look at all these trees that were down here. Look, I'm going to show you this canal right here.
Meteorologists call it the 2011 Super Outbreak, the largest, most deadly tornado outbreak ever recorded in the modern era. The kind of day that appears once in a generation, if you are unlucky enough to live through a generation that produces it. In Alabama alone, 62 tornadoes touched down on a single Wednesday afternoon. 4 of them carried winds that exceeded 200 miles per hour. 253 people in one state died in the span of a few hours. But statistics, enormous as they are, do not tell this story. The people do. The dispatcher who stayed on the phone until the line went dead. The teacher who shielded her students with her own body. The father who emerged from a collapsed house and found a world he no longer recognized. The meteorologist who stayed on air for 8 straight hours, voice steady, knowing people were dying, and the only thing between them and ignorance was his voice on a television screen. This is not a story about tornadoes. This is a story about a single day when the American South ran out of sky, and what the people caught beneath it chose to do. April in the American South carries a particular kind of beautiful tension. The winter is just loose enough that you can feel it. The air from the Gulf of Mexico begins pushing north, warm, thick with moisture, restless. Dogwoods bloom. Baseball practice runs late into the evening. The windows go down on the drive home from work, and somewhere in that beauty, every spring, is the possibility of violence. The region, known as Dixie Alley, stretching across Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, and into Georgia, produces some of the most dangerous tornado conditions on Earth. And unlike the flat, wide-open plains of the central United States, where you can often see a tornado from miles away and read its behavior against an open horizon, Dixie Alley is forested, hilly, and densely populated in the paths storms tend to travel. Trees block sight lines. Hills disrupt siren sounds. Valleys channel debris in ways that flat terrain does not. Tornadoes in the South are, statistically, more likely to occur at night, more likely to be rain-wrapped and invisible, and more likely to hit communities that have no clear line of sight to the approaching storm. These are not minor disadvantages. They are the difference between warning and impact, between a minute to react and 30 seconds. By the morning of April 27, 2011, none of this was a surprise to meteorologists. What was coming had been visible on models for days. What no model could predict was exactly what would happen to the people in its path. The conditions that produced April 27th did not arrive overnight. They assembled over days like the components of a machine being bolted together piece by piece. A powerful upper-level trough, a deep dip in the jet stream, was tracking eastward across the country. Ahead of it, surface temperatures across Alabama and Mississippi had climbed into the mid-80s. Behind a dry line to the west, a surge of dry, fast-moving air at mid-levels was racing to meet the moisture-laden surface flow from the Gulf. Wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was extreme across the entire region. This is the engine of supercell tornadoes. The greater the shear, the more organized and violent the rotation. The Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma had issued a high-risk outlook for parts of the region, the rarest and most severe designation in their arsenal. High risk is issued on average fewer than 5 times per year across the entire country. When it appears on the map, emergency managers do not treat it as routine. They mobilize. Governors across the region declared states of emergency before a single tornado had formed. Schools dismissed early. Hospitals postponed elective surgeries and called in extra staff. Emergency managers activated their systems and waited. In Birmingham, Alabama, meteorologist James Spann walked onto the set of ABC 33/40 that morning, knowing it would be one of the longest days of his career. He had been forecasting in Alabama for decades. He had seen dangerous outbreak setups before. But when he looked at the atmospheric data that morning, something in his experienced gut registered what the numbers were describing. He made a decision. He would not leave air. Not until it was over. However long that took. It took nearly 8 hours. By early afternoon, the cap, the layer of warm air that had been suppressing storm development, began to erode. And what it had been holding back was released all at once. At 10:23 a.m., the first significant tornado of the day touched down in Mississippi. By noon, there were reports of tornadoes across the region. By early afternoon, the radar screens at National Weather Service offices from Jackson to Huntsville looked like something from a simulation. Rotating supercells stacked and queued across the display, each one capable of producing a violent tornado, several of them already doing so simultaneously. The forecasters at the NWS office in Birmingham were issuing tornado warnings as fast as they could be written, not one at a time. Multiple warnings for multiple counties, for multiple storms all at once. This is not a normal operating tempo. This is a tempo that produces a particular kind of quiet dread in experienced forecasters. The knowledge that you cannot cover everything, that the warnings are going out, that the sirens are sounding, and that somewhere beyond the screen, something is happening that no radar can show you. 3 storms that day reached EF5 intensity, the maximum rating on the enhanced Fujita scale, reserved for winds exceeding 200 miles per hour and destruction so total it leaves almost no structural evidence of what once stood. The first EF5 of the day touched down in Neshoba County, Mississippi, carving a path through rural terrain before lifting. 12 people were killed. A second EF5 nearly wiped the small town of Smithville from the map. 14 of its few hundred residents were killed. Structures throughout the town were swept from their foundations. The debris field was deposited in a pattern that told the story of winds above 200 miles per hour without any instrument being necessary. The Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado was the day's most visible and most widely documented disaster. A massive, rain-wrapped EF4, nearly a mile and a half wide, tracked northeast directly through the residential and commercial heart of Tuscaloosa, home to the University of Alabama and roughly 90,000 people, before continuing northeast into the suburbs of Birmingham. The tornado was on the ground for approximately 80 miles. It killed 64 people. From the ABC 33/40 studio in Birmingham, James Spann tracked the Tuscaloosa tornado in real time, narrating its track street by street as it moved toward his own city. Viewers watching him later described his composure as the thing that kept them functional, calm, specific, urgent, but not panicked, telling people exactly where to go and exactly why. An entire metropolitan area moving through its emergency response around the voice of one man who had decided he was not leaving his chair. The Hackleburg tornado, which would become the single deadliest of the day, had already been on the ground for over an hour when it struck the Marion County community of Hackleburg with EF5 winds. 18 people were killed in Hackleburg alone. The storm continued northeast through Phil Campbell, where 21 more died. In a single tornado track, 71 lives were taken. By 8 p.m., the outbreak was beginning to slow. By 10 p.m., the last confirmed tornado of the day had lifted. The radar screens cleared, and the count began. The numbers from April 27th exist in a category of their own. Alabama, 253 dead, 62 confirmed tornadoes, 4 of them EF5, a rating so rare that most states go decades between a single EF5 event. Alabama had 4 on the same day, within the same hours. Mississippi, 37 dead, 32 tornadoes. Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia, Arkansas, fatalities in each, damage in all. In total, the single-day death toll of April 27th surpassed any tornado outbreak day in American history since the tri-state tornado of 1925, a storm from an era before radar, before the National Weather Service, before emergency alert systems of any kind. The 2011 deaths happened despite all of those things existing, despite warnings going out, despite sirens sounding, despite meteorologists doing everything the science and infrastructure allowed them to do. That fact, more than the statistics, more than the radar images, more than the photographs of flattened communities, is the one that haunts the meteorologists who worked that day. The warnings were right. The science was right. And 253 people died in Alabama anyway. Why? Researchers who studied the outbreak and its aftermath identified several converging factors. Warning fatigue. The tendency of populations who have received multiple warnings without significant impact to lower their guard played a role. The terrain of Dixie Alley masked approaching storms until it was too late for some residents to move. Mobile homes, which provide almost no protection against EF4 and EF5 winds and shelter a disproportionate share of low-income rural residents across the South, were death traps in the direct paths of the strongest tornadoes. And some people simply did not have underground shelter available. In Kansas or Oklahoma, where tornado culture runs deep and basements are nearly universal in older residential construction, a family receiving a tornado warning has a place to go. In rural Alabama and Mississippi, where basements are rare due to the clay-heavy soil and the historical building traditions of the region, a family receiving the same warning may have nowhere to go but an interior bathroom, a space that provides meaningful protection against an EF1 or EF2 and almost none against an EF4 or EF5. The stories from April 27th share a texture that words struggle to capture. In Tuscaloosa, a University of Alabama student named Lauren Rubianis took shelter in an interior bathroom of her apartment building as the tornado struck. The building was destroyed around her. She survived. Some of her neighbors did not. She later described emerging into a neighborhood she no longer recognized. Buildings she had walked past every day, simply gone, replaced by a field of rubble in which she could see personal belongings scattered. Shoes, textbooks, a child's bicycle. In Hackleburg, workers at the Wrangler jeans manufacturing plant, which took a direct EF5 hit, survived in those areas of the concrete building that held. Those caught in sections that collapsed did not. The distinction between survival and death was measured in feet. In Phil Campbell, a family sheltered in their bathtub and listened to their house disappear around them. The bathtub and the people in it were found in the debris field, intact. The house was gone. A National Guard soldier deployed to Tuscaloosa in the aftermath described the smell before anything else. Not the smell of destruction he had expected, but something else. A strange mineral, almost clean smell, like turned earth, like the world had been stripped to its foundation, and what remained was raw soil and sawdust, and the particular odor of everything familiar made suddenly unrecognizable. He had been deployed overseas. He said Tuscaloosa, in the hours after the tornado, reminded him of that. In the days after April 27th, the scale of the response matched the scale of the disaster. FEMA deployed to multiple states simultaneously. The National Guard activated across the region. Volunteer organizations that had spent decades building response capacity for exactly this kind of event mobilized within hours. From every direction, trucks and equipment and personnel converged on communities that, the day before, had been quiet places where the biggest news was the high school baseball standings. President Obama toured the damage in Alabama on April 29th, visiting communities that had been essentially removed from the map. He walked through the debris field of neighborhoods in Tuscaloosa and said to the cameras, and to no one in particular, that he had never seen anything like it. It is worth noting that he had seen a lot. The insurance claims filed in the weeks after April 27th eventually totaled more than $11 billion in insured losses alone. Total economic damage across the outbreak was estimated at over $14 billion. For context, the 2011 Super Outbreak in financial terms was one of the costliest natural disaster events in American history. But money, enormous as those numbers are, does not reassemble a community. It does not rebuild a town's sense of itself. The harder work, the work that takes not months but years, not dollars, but the slow reconstruction of shared life, began in the weeks and months after the storm. And it is, in many communities, still ongoing. In Tuscaloosa, entire residential neighborhoods were rezoned, some were rebuilt, others became parks, intentionally open space, a kind of involuntary managed retreat that the tornado had imposed and the city quietly accepted. In Hackleburg, the Wrangler plant reopened, an economic and psychological lifeline that residents described as the moment they understood their town intended to survive. In Phil Campbell, the same slow, painful, brick-by-brick process played out in a community too small for the national cameras to stay very long. The 2011 Super Outbreak did not just kill people, it changed systems. Research published in the years following the outbreak contributed directly to improvements in the National Weather Service's warning protocols for the southeastern United States. Scientists studied the terrain effects on tornado sound propagation, how hills and forest cover reduce the audible range of outdoor warning sirens, and used the data to argue for supplemental indoor alert systems, particularly in rural communities, without the infrastructure density for siren coverage. The recognition that Dixie Alley tornadoes presented a unique risk profile, terrain obscured, frequently rain-wrapped, occurring more often at night than Great Plains storms, hitting populations with less access to underground shelter, drove policy conversations at the state and federal level about shelter programs, mobile home replacement initiatives, and building code reforms. Not all of those conversations produced action. Some produced studies. Some produced studies of studies. The slow machinery of policy does not move at the speed of a tornado, but it does move. And in the years since 2011, the average tornado warning lead time in the southeastern United States has measurably improved. Warning communication has grown more specific, not just county-level alerts, but city-scale, street-scale notifications delivered to mobile devices. More underground shelters have been built in schools and community centers across Alabama and Mississippi. None of it is enough. The researchers who study this will tell you plainly that it is not enough. The gap between what the science can detect and what communities can act on in the time available remains the central unsolved problem of tornado meteorology. April 27th exposed that gap at its widest. James Spann, who stayed on air that day for nearly 8 continuous hours, was asked afterward whether he thought his broadcast made a difference. He said he didn't know. He said he hoped so. He said it was the only thing he had to give. There is a particular quality to Alabama in late April. The air is warm and full. The sky, on an ordinary day, is the kind of blue that makes it hard to believe anything bad has ever happened beneath it. And in the towns that lived through April 27, 2011, that ordinary blue sky carries a second meaning now. It is the same sky, the same air, the same spring warmth. And on certain days, when the atmosphere begins to organize the way it organized that afternoon, when the wind shifts and the temperature drops and the clouds begin to take on that particular stillness before they move, the people who lived through it feel something that has no clinical name but is instantly recognizable. They move. They don't wait for the sirens. They don't wait for confirmation. They move because the sky told them something once at enormous cost, and they decided that they would not need to be told twice. The 2011 Super Outbreak was the largest, deadliest tornado outbreak in recorded history. It is what the sky is capable of when everything goes wrong at once. It is also what people are capable of in the middle of it and in the long, hard years of rebuilding that come after.